what is it that you did that maybe our listeners could take away and apply to what they do?
Well, I think that the trick for us in doing this was really always about, and if you're not on it, if you're not watching that and being ready to adjust to it, then you can be left behind in a heartbeat.
If I carried on doing things the way I did only 2 years ago, it wouldn't work now, and the business would fail.
If you're doing that, and it doesn't matter whether it's a movie or it's anything else, the question you have to ask is...
Welcome to the Marketing Game. Now, in this episode, it's going to be a little bit different. Normally, we have the game, but I'm doing a remote recording today, and we can't play the game because our guest, Rob Hollocks, he's in the USA, in California. Rob is a film director and formerly a marketer for Paramount. So we're going to dive in to find out what it is about marketing in the movie industry that also translates to marketing for businesses here in the UK now. Rob, how you doing? Thanks for joining us.
I'm good. Good to see you, Gillan. How's it going?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. I'm good. How is life there in California?
Pretty good. It feels like I'm back in England in a minute. We've had the last 4 months full of rain and cold and, not quite what I signed up for, but it's all right. It reminds me of home.
You've been there a while, haven't you?
God, yeah, I've been coming up on 21 years now, actually. It's coming 21 years, 22 in January.
So tell your audience more about what you're doing now. So you're a movie director now, but formerly a marketer, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, basically right now I write, produce, direct independent movies. I kind of got into that really through my marketing work. I started off as a marketing person before even moving into entertainment. And over the years, got more and more involved in the production side. I did a lot of documentaries, special features for Paramount. Then started my own company. We started doing more and more of those kind of marketing content, viral videos, supplemental storytelling, documentaries and stuff, and then kind of gradually made the move into full-blown features.
So you worked for Paramount when you were in marketing, is that right?
That's right, yeah. When I first started, they were a joint venture company with Universal. They had a company called CIC Video and UIP Films. So they kind of distributed stuff together. And then when I joined, I was part of that group, but I'd always worked on Paramount titles. And then when they split, I ended up staying with Paramount and ultimately ended up coming out here to the US, working for the studio out here in Hollywood.
All right, and so what titles have you worked on?
Yeah, well, I was lucky. I joined Paramount when they were kind of really at their peak. So first project I worked on was Forrest Gump, which was pretty cool. And then got to work on movies like Braveheart and Titanic and Indiana Jones and all sorts of other stuff as well. So, I the Mission Impossible movies. And I also had responsibility for the Star Trek brand, so both the films and TV as well. So, yeah, it's a pretty wide range of stuff and really, really cool projects to work on.
And what is it about marketing in the movies that most people wouldn't know? Let's start with the difference before we get into the similarities.
The main difference between marketing for film and TV as opposed to brand marketing, consumer marketing, is I think a lot of the times you're working with ever-changing projects and ever-changing products, whereas, a lot of time if you're marketing a brand or a service, you have those core elements that remain consistent throughout whatever you do, even if you end up doing different versions of that. With a movie, it tends to vary depending on the project that you're working on. Yeah, you have the underlying core values of the studio that you're trying to project, but also, obviously how you market a Star Trek movie is very different to how you'd market Mission Impossible or Paranormal Activities or all that kind of thing. So it's very tactical in terms of how you approach this stuff. Right.
So more of a project by project, almost like an agency type role rather than marketing for a brand.
Yeah, it's very much like that. There are certain things that you do have control over. There are brands and franchises. So, for example, things like Star Trek's a good example of that. The Mission Impossible franchise, Indiana Jones, when it was part of the Paramount portfolio. So there's a combination of stuff, and that's what makes it really interesting, I think. You get to work on a lot of varied projects, a lot of very different brand values, and a lot of different elements of the marketing mix as well.
Right, and what sort of elements would that be?
Well, one of the things, when I was there, I worked on the international side. So I was the Vice President of International Marketing for Paramount. So, I would work with something like 20, 30 different markets around the world. So we would have the central core values of the campaign that we're trying to get out there. But then you take that and you then have to help the territories translate it into stuff that works in their market. And so, for example, something in Spain would be very different to how you market something in Japan. So, on top of the individual elements of the projects, you then had to take into account how do you market those things successfully in different cultures and different environments and stuff as well. So it was a very complex system of working that out. And it varied. Sometimes back then you'd focus a lot on TV advertising, radio advertising. Obviously, it was much less fragmented than it is now, and it was easy to get eyeballs on a TV campaign than it is now. Social marketing was just starting. We really focused a lot on viral activities and interesting story extensions and stuff to add value to certain content. And we still did some print, a lot of promotional stuff with retailers and markets. So in the UK, we'd work very closely with people like Asda and Tesco's and WH Smith, Auchan in France, that kind of stuff. So it was a real mixed bag. And one of the things I loved about it as a marketer is that you really had full access to a wide range of tactics and strategies to kind of implement your marketing plan.
And in terms of those strategies, like with audience identification, did you have practices for identifying new audiences, or did you rely on sort of old lists that you had? Like how did that work?
It's a combination. We did tend to keep a lot of customer database and consumer information where we could, and so we used part of that. We used data, but unlike sort of these days, we weren't solely reliant on that. We tended to use a lot of qualitative stuff as well. So we would use focus groups, research, going out and talking to consumers, finding out what interested them. So it was much more of a full range of skills in terms of how we went after people and how we approached different audiences.
Right. So you're saying focus groups there. Would you say it was less data driven in terms of digital data and more
very much.
Sort of organic?
Yeah, much more organic. I mean, one of the issues I have, I think, in the way that we approach, particularly film marketing these days, so much of it is done via data and research. There's a lot less consumer interaction than there used to be, and I think that was a change in terms of the type of people coming into the industry. In the early 2000s, there was a big move to as the studios were being acquired by these big communication conglomerates, whether it's Viacom or whoever. There was this kind of effort to make it more of a FMCG marketing environment. Which is great in some respects, but it's very different in terms of the way that you market a movie versus how you would market a packet of cornflakes. It's a very different proposition, and I think sometimes the industry today becomes too hung up on data and numbers as opposed to actually the qualitative stuff and what people feel and think. I mean, movies are a very emotional proposition. They're products that really drive by how people feel about them. And I think numbers only take you so far before you have to make that leap and start figuring some of those other factors to it as well to make a successful campaign.
Absolutely. That makes me think of some of the classic sort of 90s movies, like Jurassic Park. There had never been a very successful dinosaur movie before then. And, who was to say who could have predicted the franchise that turned into? Right. Now, if they'd been relying on data rather than Spielberg and the power of the story, I don't think that film necessarily would have got made now. And maybe the same for Pirates of the Caribbean. There hadn't been a successful pirate movie for decades, and yet they took a risk on it. And again, a massive franchise. And I think that I agree with you about data, that if you focus too much on the data that you have, you're ignoring the data that you don't have, and you become quite blinkered, I think, in your decision making.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, you touched on something that I think is really important, and that's risk taking. The movie industry has always had a history of taking risks, of trying new things, and and the business model was very different, some time ago. I mean, these days you either have these big $200-300 million blockbusters, or you have the very small independent movies. There used to be a lot of middle ground there. You'd have these movies between 30-50 million that would generate revenue, would do well. They'd do well in theatrically, then they'd do well on DVD, TV, etc., etc. And that whole middle section is gone now. And unfortunately, what that means is that everything's much more high risk, particularly for these big studios investing in these big blockbusters. And it's made them very risk averse. And you can see that in the content that's put out these days. So much of the stuff is sequels, reboots, reimaginings, that kind of stuff. Nobody wants to take a risk on something new, which I think is very sad and actually detracts from the business in the long run. But I think part of that all kind of feeds into the whole idea about over-reliance on statistics, over-reliance on data, and you lose that kind of emotional connection with the audience, and therefore you're not making stuff that necessarily speaks to them outside of the commercial side. And I think that's a shame. I think that's something we need to recapture.
I think you're right. And I think also that the channels have changed. So it used to be, like you mentioned, DVD. I mean, that was huge. And I remember, I forget which actor it was, but he was saying like basically you got paid twice. You got paid when the movie came out, and you had the box office back end, and then you had it again when it came out on DVD, and that's gone away. Yeah. And I think a lot of the mid-range titles did really well on DVD,
right?
And they're not getting pushed on the digital channels.
Right.
And I think that the disruption that happened with the streamers, yes, it disrupted the industry, but I think not necessarily for the better. Not better for consumers, because there's fewer titles available now on Netflix than there used to be, and you can't get a lot of the movies that you'd want to watch. You simply can't get them. They're not available. They're not available to buy on DVD anymore, and the streamers just aren't showing them, and Netflix are reducing the amount of titles now rather than expanding their library. And it's really difficult for a filmmaker to go from an indie up to jumping that gap. I mean, there's very few that get the privilege to work on these big blockbusters.
Right.
So I think that disruption is good as long as it's disrupting things in a positive way. And I'm not sure that that's really happened in the film industry, to be honest.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think there's a lot of good that's come from the streaming industry, and it has helped shake up some things that needed shaking up. But the issue is, I think it's kind of almost come full circle now, whereas the big streamers are now becoming what the studios were, and that's not always a good thing. I mean, again, Netflix is a great example. They disrupted the industry. They came in there, but they're not producing as much product as they used to. They're not producing a lot of indie product anymore. Their blockbusters are all $200-300 million movies with big A-listers in there, and there's no opportunity for newer talent to come up through the ranks like they used to be. It's just, if you're risking $200-300 million on a movie, you need it to be a sure bet. Therefore, you need to have X, Y, and Z actors attached to it, because they're the most well known in the industry. You need to have this director attached to it, and I think that just all that does is erode the level of storytelling and the level of quality in the projects, where everything becomes created via a committee, by a series of accountants and legal people who are like, if you do X, Y, and Z, you'll get this result, and that's what they base it on, as opposed to, well, maybe we take a risk. If you look at Paramount, it's a great example. Back in the 70s, when they took a huge risk on the Godfather movies, and they arguably changed the face of cinema in a lot of ways. But if they hadn't taken that risk, Coppola maybe would never had a career. Al Pacino, there's so many what ifs, but they took a risk on that. They knew it was a huge risk, and it was a fight to get it done. And if there's a great show on Paramount, if you haven't seen it, called The Offer, which is the story of the Godfather and how that's made. And of course, parts of it are very fictional, but a lot of that's truth in terms of how people are willing to put their neck on the line and take risks to get great stories told. And I think it's sad. I just don't see as much of that these days. I think it's part of the process when a big corporation takes over something like this. They're looking to create the best dividends for their shareholders. That's what it becomes. It's less about the consumer. It's less about the customer. It's less about the quality. It's about how can we make as much money as we can for our shareholders, quicker and faster. And that becomes the most important decision, which isn't where it should be, I think.
You just mentioned the shareholders, and I think that goes beyond filmmaking. I think that we're seeing that across all sectors, where shareholders have become really the main customer, in the sense of the person that the C-suite are concerned with. They're not even concerned with their own staff, customers, suppliers. It's all about what's best for the shareholder, and I think that's bringing a lot of issues, which maybe we won't delve into on a marketing podcast. But the other thing that you mentioned, which I think applies, is the nurturing of talent, and I think that's really important. You need to give people a chance to make mistakes and a space to do that, and the studio system used to do that. They used to nurture somebody through, and they would be given so many picture deals, kind of like you had in the music industry, where you'd have like a 3-album or 5-album deal, and now it goes single to single, and I think that the result of that is we're not getting the quality coming through that we would have done. And there are some fantastic talent out there, but what about the new talent that needs to be nurtured through? And that makes me wonder, where are we going to be in 10 years' time, 20 years' time?
There are still some companies out there who do try and do that. I mean, sadly, they're in the minority now, and I think it is something that needs to change. I think people are seeing that. I mean, if you look on, business media, Variety, LinkedIn, whatever it is, every day it feels like there's a story on there about Hollywood is dying, and it's going through a tough time for a whole bunch of reasons, some of which are the things we've talked about. But I don't think all hope's lost. I mean, there's always people out there trying to do things differently, trying to change the market, trying to get some of those values and those strategies back in play. And I think the important thing, I think, is really just to not give up and just keep trying, because ultimately the whole idea of a business being focused around its shareholders is self-defeating, because you get to the point where if you spend so much time appeasing the shareholders, you end up losing customers in the long run, and that's the danger. So you've got to end up looking forward. And I think the other big factor for me in terms of marketing, bring it back to marketing in terms of movie stuff, is having people marketing movies. Well, it's like any marketing business. You've got to care about your product. You've got to feel passionate about your brand. You've got to be able to. You should be the best advocate for your brand over anyone else. You understand its strengths, its weaknesses, its benefits, all that kind of stuff. And if you don't have a marketing team or a marketing strategy in place that reflects that kind of is driven by a passionate commitment to quality and good communication, then I think you're sunk.
I think you're right, and I think to take that point a little further, it comes down to authentic emotional connections. And I think that doing things by data removes that emotional component, and I think that people are looking for authenticity now. Certainly, I think more than ever. Like the pandemic, we all went away, and now people are craving human connection. As John was saying from Smeg in the first episode, like that's what they've discovered is that people crave in-person events. They want to make real human connections, and I think that they want to connect with real emotions, like authentic emotional hooks, not just something contrived because the data says so. But and as you say, if you're not actually passionate about it, you can't expect your audience to be.
The issue for me is that you can't have an emotional business driven on people's feelings and authenticity that are driven purely by numbers. You can't just construct things like that, because ultimately they're not authentic, and people will see through that and they'll fall away from it. Movies are all about making you feel something. Whether it's anger, excitement, happiness, sadness, whatever it is, they promote an emotional response, and you can't use an algorithm to predict that. There's the old joke about, marketing is just sales with a college degree. And, I think a lot of people like to pretend it's a science, and it's not just a science. There are scientific elements to it. There's also a lot of intuition and instinct and authenticity and passion and emotion that a good marketer brings to the table. And it's a blend of those skills. It's a hybrid. It's not just scientific, it's artistic. And I think good marketers, the really good marketers who are out there and do a great job, understand that.
One thing that you used to do that some of our viewers will be doing was maybe remarketing old products and services, existing services, and coming up with new messages for things that have been already introduced to the audience. The audience are aware of this. How did you do that? Because I know that you used to repackage titles. What is it that you did that maybe our listeners could take away and apply to what they do?
Well, I think the trick for us in doing this was really always about adding real value to something. You can't just slap a new wrapper on it and put it out there and expect people to be excited about it. You've got to understand your audience, what they like, what they want, what they're looking for, what would motivate them. And you can only do that by talking to them. An example is, when I used to work on Star Trek, when we had new projects in development, new packaging or reissues or whatever they were, I would go down to the conventions and I'd go and visit them, and I'd kind of do like a impromptu market research group. We'd talk to people about what we were doing. What do you like? Do you like this? And do you think this would work? What can we do that would make this more interesting for you? And that's so invaluable, talking to the people who ultimately own and buy the product, who are invested in it, and to a degree own it. They feel like they own this stuff. They're so passionate about it, and they often know more about it than the marketers do. And you can't always follow that 100%, but it's a great way of learning what people want. And so for me, whenever we would repackage a film or a project, it could be anything from, say, Star Trek. It could be going back to classic movies like Zulu or The Italian Job, another one that I worked on. It's about what is most meaningful to this audience. What questions they have that they haven't had answered. What value can we bring them? Who can we interview? What other value can we add to it? And I think if you're doing that, and it doesn't matter whether it's a movie or it's anything else, the question you have to ask is, realistically and authentically, how can I add real value to this project that's perceived by the audience as being real, that it's not just a cash grab. You're not just repackaging something and slapping it out there and hoping people will buy it again. Give them a reason, give them a real reason to want something. And that's how we would approach everything. That was always our first question when we sat down to talk about this stuff, is like, how can we make this special? An example of that would be Once Upon a Time in the West. I worked on the reissue of that. And, it took a lot of time and a lot of effort. We hunted down the original version of the movie, got it remastered. We went out, we got interviews with the remaining cast who were still alive, and people like Ennio Morricone at the time who were still alive, and just everyone we could, because we knew this particular release would appeal to cinephiles, it would appeal to people who love movies and love the history of movies and stuff as well. So how do we do that to elevate that? And so it took a lot of time. It took a couple of years to do that, put it all together, and it was something that won a bunch of awards and was recognized for that, and I was very proud to be part of that team.
Right, so you took time to generate something of real value rather than a cynical cash grab, as you said.
Right, yeah, to do it properly, to really do it properly. And it's like, if I'm a fan of that movie, what would make me excited about wanting to see this again? What's the added value? What's the new value proposition we can add to something to make it special again?
It always comes down to a creative solution to the problem.
One of the things I like about marketing is it's a very creative business. You can have a lot of fun creating great marketing campaigns that work well and that really speak to people. And there's nothing more exciting than having a campaign that works, because it means you've touched people in some way. You've been able to affect them in some way and actually tell them something that excites them, motivates them, and makes them feel good while helping business as well. And like you said, it's an immediate business. You have to pivot constantly sometimes. You release something, and if it's not working, you have to be in there and tweaking it quickly. And there's a really exciting, exhilarating aspect to that, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying, and I like the immediate pivot if you need to.
Yeah.
Just keep ahead of the game.
Yeah, it's a good way to be in business. I mean, that's the thing. You've got to be on top of this stuff all the time, because the market changes, the environment changes, people's attitudes. Sometimes in a heartbeat, something external can trigger something that affects you, and if you're not on it, if you're not watching that and being ready to adjust to it, then you can be left behind in a heartbeat. A great example of that, going back a few years, was the whole Gerald Ratner thing, with him saying about the crap that he made, and it actually killed his business. And that was like one badly judged comment destroyed that business.
He didn't handle it very well. I think
yeah,
he didn't pivot. He didn't. It's not just campaign to campaign. You've got to keep your eyes on what's happening in terms of the way the industry is moving. Like I started Clarity, the brand, just a couple of years ago, and what worked in terms of lead acquisition 2 years ago doesn't necessarily work now, and I'm having to completely change the way that I'm approaching the market, and it's very much about authenticity, very much about personal connection, very much about putting the face to your brand. And if I carried on doing things the way I did only 2 years ago, it wouldn't work now, and the business would fail. So you've got to keep not just innovating, but you've got to keep listening to your audience. And I guess that comes back around to what you were saying at the beginning. It's talking to your audience and finding out what they want.
Yeah, it really is. Like you're right, it changes so fast these days. Like you say, something in fashion now be out of fashion in 6 months, and you just don't know what's going to affect that. And I think you have to be on top of it. You have to be passionate about it. You have to care. You have to be involved in that, and you can't just sit back on your laurels and just wait for business to come to you. You have to fight for everything. And you know what? That's exciting in a lot of ways. It's tough. It's certainly hard, and it's not easy to do that. But I think if you're responsible for a business, for a brand, for a product that has legs, that's not just a 3 months in and out kind of thing, you have to. That's your responsibility. You have to be on that, and you have to be able to anticipate what's coming ahead, anticipate what changes are coming, and be able to have the foresight to adapt your product or service or brand to whatever's ahead as best you can. You can't always do that correctly, but it's a real art. For me, it's an art, not science. It's really, you have to have an understanding of human emotion, what the environment is happening around you at any moment in time, and an understanding of the tools you have to be able to kind of market yourself and your projects properly and authentically.
Yeah, authenticity really is the buzzword at the moment. I also want to know, what was your greatest marketing achievement? What are you most proud of?
One of the things that I was very happy with, it's not necessarily a one-off campaign, but was more of a brand strategy, was Star Trek internationally, actually. When I joined, the Next Generation, which was the huge series, was starting to come to the end, and they were releasing Voyager, which is the next one along, and they had Deep Space Nine and all these other ancillary things. And, traditionally they'd always been very big in certain markets. They'd been huge in the UK, they'd been huge in America, of course, the US. And so we spent a lot of time kind of trying to formulate plans to seed that out in different markets, to be able to kind of try and grow the brand in places that where it traditionally wasn't strong. France, Spain, some of the Japan's another one, all that kind of stuff as well. And we that was a long-term plan. We had about a 5-6 year plan in terms of doing that. And at the end of the day, after that time, we were able to kind of come up with a number of local-based strategies that helped Star Trek as a brand find a presence in those markets. And that was really rewarding to us. It was really a way of finding a great way to build the business. It was a great way to expose people to a really quality product. And I think the team I had worked with were great. Everybody worked really hard to kind of find really interesting, creative ways to expand that brand. I was always very proud of that as an achievement.
And similarly, when we released Hosts, which is the feature that I produced in 2020, that went out across multiple territories. Obviously not to the scale that you worked on, but what I found very interesting, was even the title would change. And there was a buzzword a while ago, it was like personalization.
Yeah.
And one size does not fit all. Right. And again, that comes down to, what does the audience want? What's best for them? Right. And seeing the way that they changed the messaging for this horror that went to North America was very different to the way they marketed it in Europe. And even each territory in Europe was very different. And then again in Asia and Australia. And it was, that it sort of reinforces the point about understanding your audience and having the right messaging for them.
One size does not fit all. That's a corporate strategy because it's cost effective, but it doesn't work when you're looking at international markets. It really doesn't. Yeah, unless you're a Coca-Cola or something like that,
Well, but then the messaging is different territory to territory, isn't it? They frame it differently depending on where they're marketing it.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing. I mean, it's understanding that everybody's different, and everybody has different needs, and you can't just blanket market to people.
Mm-hmm. What's the one piece of advice that you want to leave with the audience?
I think the one piece of advice I'd leave for people is just don't give up. It's very easy to become disheartened this day with all the noise and the chatter that's around, and there's so much stuff, so much negativity out there, so many naysayers about the death of this, at the end of this, or just you have to try and tune that out and focus on what you want and what you're trying to achieve. There are always solid marketing principles that you can apply for any situation. There's always solid business principles you can apply for most situations. And I think you've just got to believe in what you're trying to do and don't give up, because you only fail when you give up. And there's too many great, talented people out there with some great projects, great brands, great services that are trying to get those cut through. And it's just do not give up. Keep trying. It's worth it in the end.
That's great advice. And I think the film industry is a fantastic example of that, because the death of the movies has been predicted since they brought out color and sound and television, video, the internet, streamers, and there has always been innovation. People have always managed to keep it going.
Yeah, but it's a tough industry. I think I look at, sometimes I get up in the morning and I'm like, why do I do this for a living? Why do I put myself through this every day? The answer is because I love it, because I really enjoy it. It means something to me and it makes me happy. And but it's just you've got to keep sight of it. At the end of the day, as any kind of creative, any kind of business person, what does it mean to you? Is it worth getting up and fighting every day to make that happen? And if the answer is yes, have at it. Don't give up, and don't let anyone take it away from you.
Brilliant, Rob. I think that's a perfect place to finish. But thank you so much for your time and your insights. I find it very interesting, and I'm sure our listeners will.
Thank you. My pleasure. I enjoyed it.
Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this, please like, share, subscribe, rate it, review it, all the stuff. You know what to do. It helps us so much. The algorithm will push us up. We'll get this out to as many people as we possibly can. Thank you again, and keep tuned for the next episode.